Hello, everyone. If you're settling in for the night, getting comfortable, maybe pulling your blanket just a little tighter around your shoulders, I'm glad you're here. I know so many of you listen while you're drifting off to sleep, and there's something I find really beautiful about that. In the quiet hours when the world finally slows down, that's when these stories deserve to be told. So before we begin tonight, go ahead and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Whether it's late at night in a small town, or early morning somewhere across the world, I always love knowing who's out there listening. And if you haven't already, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It truly means everything, and it helps these stories reach more people who care about them. Now, get comfortable. Close your eyes if you'd like. Take a slow breath, because tonight, we're going to talk about a young woman who disappeared into the darkness of a California night and never came back. A young woman full of life, full of music, full of love, who simply vanished without a trace. Her name was Elaine Park. She was 23 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. And then, one cold January morning, she was gone. This is her story. Let's begin. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over Los Angeles in the early hours of the morning. It's not the silence of peace, not exactly. It's more like the city holding its breath. The highways thin out. The restaurants close. The lights in apartment windows blink out one by one. And for a few fragile hours, this enormous, restless city almost feels still. Almost feels safe. It was in that kind of quiet that Elaine Park was last seen alive, January 28, 2017. A Saturday that had started like so many others, ordinary, unremarkable. Filled with the small moments that only feel significant in hindsight. Elaine had spent the evening with her boyfriend at his home in Calabasas, a wealthy suburb nestled in the hills on the western edge of Los Angeles County. Calabasas is the kind of place where the streets are clean and the houses are large and the mountains rise up golden in the afternoon light. It is, by most measures, a comfortable and beautiful place to live. A safe place. Elaine left that house sometime after midnight. Her boyfriend would later say they had argued, that she had been upset, that she had gotten into her car, a silver 2003 Honda Accord, and driven away into the night. And then she was simply gone, no phone calls, no text messages, no goodbyes, no trace. Her car was found 5 days later, on February 2nd, parked along Mulholland Highway near the Malibu Creek State Park area, a stretch of road that winds through the Santa Monica Mountains, dramatic and beautiful and deeply, profoundly isolated. The car was unlocked. Her phone was inside, her wallet was inside, her keys were inside. Everything she would have needed to survive was left behind, as though she had simply stepped out of her life and walked away into the wilderness. But Elaine Park did not walk away. People who knew her, who loved her, knew that immediately. Elaine was not someone who disappeared. She was not someone who abandoned her family, her music, her future. She was someone who called her mother every single day. And on the morning of January 29, 2017, she didn't call. That was how her mother, Camelia Park, first knew something was wrong. Not a dramatic revelation. Not a frantic phone call from a stranger. Just the absence of her daughter's voice on the other end of the line. Just silence where there should have been warmth. That silence would stretch on for months. For years, it stretches on still. Elaine Park has never been found. To understand why this case breaks your heart the way it does, why it has stayed with so many people for so long, you have to understand who Elaine was. Not just as a missing person. Not just as a name attached to a case file. You have to understand her as a human being, as a daughter, as a friend, as an artist, because Elaine Park was all of those things deeply and fully, and the world she left behind was so much richer for having had her in it. Elaine G. Young Park was born on April 5, 1993 in South Korea. Her family immigrated to the United States when she was young, settling in Southern California, where she would grow up, go to school, fall in love with music, and build a life that seemed, by every outward measure, to be full of promise and possibility. She was the kind of person who lit up a room. That phrase gets used a lot, sometimes to the point where it loses its meaning. But the people who knew Elaine used it with a particular conviction, a particular weight, as though they were reaching for language that could actually contain the reality of who she was and finding it almost inadequate. She was magnetic. She had a smile that her mother described as capable of making anyone feel instantly at ease, and a laugh that her friends said they could pick out of a crowd. She was warm and generous and deeply empathetic, the kind of person who noticed when you were struggling before you had said a word about it. She was also extraordinarily talented. Elaine was a musician, a cellist, trained and dedicated, who had spent years developing a skill that her instructors recognized as something genuinely special. She had studied at California State University, Northridge, where she pursued music with the kind of seriousness that only comes from real love, not performance, not resume, build and bone, deep love for the craft. She practiced for hours. She performed. She poured herself into the music in a way that people who watched her play said was almost difficult to look away from. But Elaine was more than just her talent. She was a daughter who called her mother every day without fail. She was a friend who showed up, not just in the easy moments, but in the hard ones. She was the person you called when you were scared, when you were sad, when you didn't know what to do next. She was, by all accounts, someone who made the people around her feel seen and loved and less alone in the world. She had dreams. Big ones, and small ones too. She wanted to continue performing. She wanted to travel. She had talked, in the months before her disappearance, about where she wanted to go, what she wanted to build, who she wanted to become. She was 23 years old and the world was still wide open in front of her. She deserved every bit of it. And then she vanished. The months leading up to Elaine's disappearance were not entirely easy ones. People who loved her and have spoken publicly about that period describe a young woman who was navigating some emotional turbulence. The kind that is common enough in your early 20s. The kind that feels enormous when you're inside it, even if it looks manageable from the outside. She had been dealing with feelings of depression and anxiety. She had been seeing a therapist. She was working through things, the way people do day by day and imperfectly, and with the support of the people who loved her. It is important to say that clearly, and it is equally important to say what those who knew her most intimately have said clearly and repeatedly: Elaine Park was not suicidal. She was not someone who had expressed any desire to harm herself. She was someone who was struggling, yes, but she was also someone who was actively engaged in getting help, in moving forward, in building the life she wanted. Her mother and her close friends have been unequivocal on this point. Whatever Elaine was going through in the months before she disappeared, it was not a state of mind that pointed towards self-destruction. She was trying. She was still very much here, very much present, very much looking forward. That context matters. It matters because in the early stages of her disappearance, there were suggestions from some investigators, from some commentators, that Elaine may have harmed herself, that her disappearance might be explained by her mental health struggles. Her family pushed back against that narrative firmly and consistently, not in denial, not in the way of people refusing to accept a painful truth, but in the way of people who knew their loved one better than any stranger could, and who recognized that the narrative being constructed around her was inaccurate and unfair. Elaine was struggling. Elaine was also alive and engaged and loved and loving. Those two things can coexist. They did coexist in her, until January 28, 2017. Now let's go back to that night. Let's walk through what we know carefully, because the details matter here, and the gaps between them matter just as much. Elaine had been in a relationship with a man named Gabe, whose last name is kept out of much of the public reporting, though he has been identified in various places as Gabe Del Castillo or similar, for some period of time before her disappearance. The exact nature and duration of the relationship has been described in different ways by different people, but what is established is that on the night of January 27th into the early hours of January 28, 2017, Elaine was at Gabe's home in Calabasas. At some point during that evening, the two of them argued. The details of the argument, what it was about, how serious it was, how it escalated, have not been fully disclosed publicly. What has been disclosed is that after the argument, Elaine got into her car and left. This was somewhere in the early morning hours of January 28th, reports have placed the time at various points between midnight and around 2 a.m. Though the exact time has not been definitively pinned down in public reporting, she drove away from Calabasas. She drove into the night, and at some point, her car ended up parked along Mulholland Highway near Malibu Creek State Park, approximately 7 to 8 miles from where she had been. That drive, those 7 or 8 miles, represent the last confirmed movement in Elaine Park's life. Her boyfriend told investigators that after she left, he didn't immediately reach out to her family or contact authorities. There are questions that her mother and investigators have wrestled with, about the timeline of when concern was raised, when calls were made, when the official machinery of a missing persons investigation began to turn. These questions don't have clean, satisfying answers. What is known is that by the time her family realized she was gone and authorities were notified, hours had already passed. By the time her car was found, 5 days had gone by. 5 days in which Elaine Park, wherever she was, whatever had happened to her, was out there. 5 days in which the trail, whatever trail there was to follow, had grown cold. The discovery of her car on Mulholland Highway raised far more questions than it answered, because nothing about what was found inside that car suggested a voluntary departure from her life. Her phone, her wallet, her keys. The items that a person takes with them when they leave, the items that represent, in the most priddy to exist in the modern world, were all left behind. Without her phone, she couldn't call for help, couldn't contact her mother, couldn't reach anyone who loved her. Without her wallet, she couldn't buy food, couldn't pay for shelter, couldn't access money. Without her keys, she couldn't get back into her car. Whoever or whatever had taken Elaine Park from that car, or had left her somewhere without those things, had left her completely without resources, completely vulnerable. The area where the car was found adds another layer of gravity to the situation. Mulholland Highway through the Santa Monica Mountains is not the kind of place you want to be alone at night. It is beautiful during the day, the kind of landscape that makes you understand why people fall in love with California, with the light in the hills and the vast, complicated sky. But at night, it is dark and isolated and the terrain is rugged. There are trails that wind through the park, through Malibu Creek State Park, through the surrounding hills, but they are not easy trails. They are not the kind of terrain you navigate casually, in the dark, without equipment, without a plight. Without Elaine was not dressed for hiking. She was not prepared for the wilderness. She had left a house after an argument, in the middle of the night wearing whatever she had been wearing that evening. She was not equipped for what the mountains would demand of anyone who ventured into them in those conditions. So what happened? Where did she go? Why was her car there? These are the questions that have haunted her family, her friends, investigators, and the thousands of people who have followed this case in the years since her disappearance. These are the questions that do not yet have answers. But there are details, threads that investigators and amateur researchers and Elaine's own family have pulled on, carefully and sometimes painfully, that suggest the story of what happened to Elaine Park is more complicated, and perhaps more sinister than a simple disappearance. Let's start talking about what the investigation found. When law enforcement recovered Elaine's car on February 2nd, they were working a missing persons case, and at that point, the working theory for at least some investigators seemed to lean toward the possibility that Elaine had left voluntarily, or that her mental health struggles had played a role in her disappearance. That framing frustrated her family enormously. Her mother, Camelia, would later speak publicly and passionately about the way she felt investigators were not taking the case seriously enough, were not pursuing it with the urgency it deserved, were too quick to assume explanations that her family knew to be inconsistent with who Elaine was. Camelia Park became, in many ways, the engine of this investigation in its early years. She was relentless. She organized search parties. She kept the story alive in the media. She spoke to anyone who would listen. She refused, absolutely refused, to let her daughter be forgotten, to let her case become one of those files that sits in a drawer and gathers dust, while the people who loved the victim wait and wait and wait for answers that never come. The searches were extensive and heartbreaking. Volunteers combed the hills around Malibu Creek State Park. Search and rescue teams went through the terrain. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters flew over the mountains. And they found nothing, no clothing, no personal items, no remains. No sign whatsoever Elaine Park had ever been in those hills at all. That absence of evidence is itself a kind of evidence. It suggests, though it does not prove, that Elaine did not simply walk into the wilderness and become lost. If she had, there would likely be some trace. The terrain is challenging, but it is not infinite. Search teams are thorough. The fact that nothing was found in the immediate area around her car has led investigators and researchers to consider the possibility that she was not in that area at all, or that she had been moved. The question of her car's location has been a persistent one. Why was it there? Did Elaine drive it there herself? Or was it driven there by someone else? The car being found there could mean Elaine drove to that location for some reason we don't understand. Or it could mean someone drove it there and left it, hoping the mountains would provide a convenient narrative that Elaine had wandered in and disappeared, a sad story with a sad but explicable ending. Her phone records became a crucial piece of the puzzle. In the days following her disappearance, investigators and her family attempted to trace the activity on her phone, to understand where she had been, what she had done, whether anyone had contacted her, or whether she had tried to reach out to anyone. The details of what was found in those records have not been fully disclosed publicly, but what has been established is that there was phone activity in the hours immediately following her departure from Calabasas, and then silence. That silence again. There were other details that emerged as the investigation deepened. Details that shifted the shape of the story in uncomfortable ways. There were questions about the relationship between Elaine and her boyfriend, about the nature of the argument that preceded her departure, about the timeline of events that night, about what he knew and when he knew it. Her mother has been vocal about her concerns regarding how Gabe handled the aftermath of Elaine's disappearance, about questions she felt were not adequately answered, about a timeline that did not, in her view, entirely add up. These are serious questions. They deserve serious examination. And we are going to examine them. But first, let's talk about the broader context of where Elaine's car was found. Because there is something about the location of Malibu Creek State Park that, once you know it, you cannot unknow. Something that changes the texture of this story in a way that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Malibu Creek State Park and the surrounding area of the Santa Monica Mountains has a history. A dark one. In the years surrounding Elaine Park's disappearance, the park and the Mulholland Highway corridor had been the site of multiple disturbing incidents. There had been reports of shootings near the park, incidents that would eventually become connected to a case that sent shockwaves through the community. And there were other disappearances, other cases, other young people who had gone missing or been found dead in the mountains around this area, in circumstances that were never fully explained. The park is vast and beautiful, and it has, over the years, harbored darkness alongside its natural splendor. It is a place where people go to hike and camp and lose themselves in the landscape, and it is also, apparently, a place where some people have been lost in far more permanent and terrible ways. The proximity of Elaine's car to this location was not lost on investigators or researchers. Was it a coincidence? Was it significant? Was there a connection between whatever happened to Elaine and the other dark events that had occurred in and around that area? Those questions don't have definitive answers, but they have shaped the direction of the investigation, and they have shaped the way many people think about this case. Let's keep going. Because there is more to tell, and the story is only getting darker, continuing from where we left off. In the weeks following the discovery of Elaine's car, the investigation began to expand in scope and in complexity. Law enforcement was working multiple angles simultaneously, searching the terrain, reviewing phone records, interviewing witnesses, and attempting to piece together a coherent picture of Elaine's final hours. But progress was slow, frustratingly, agonizingly slow, and for Camellia Park, every day that passed without answers was another day her daughter was out there somewhere, unknown and unfound. Let's talk about the searches in more detail. because they tell us something important. Not just about what investigators found, but about what they didn't find, and what that absence means. The initial searches focused heavily on the area immediately surrounding where Elaine's car was discovered. Mulholland Highway near Las Virgenes Road, the specific stretch where the silver Honda Accord was found parked, sits at the edge of Malibu Creek State Park, which encompasses nearly 8 acres of rugged Santa Monica Mountains terrain. Chaparral, oak woodlands, rocky creek beds, steep hillsides that drop away suddenly and without warning. It is the kind of landscape that is genuinely dangerous to navigate without preparation. And it is the kind of landscape that can conceal things or people with terrifying efficiency. Search teams went in on foot. They used dogs trained to track human scent. They used helicopters equipped with thermal imaging. They searched the creek beds and the hillsides and the trails and the areas off the trails, where someone might go if they are following any path at all. They searched in the immediate vicinity of the car. They searched wider. They pushed further into the park than anyone would reasonably walk from where the car was found, especially in the dark, especially without proper gear or shoes or preparation. They found nothing. Not a piece of clothing, not a shoe, not a personal item, not a strand of hair. Not any biological trace whatsoever that placed Elaine Park in those hills on the night she disappeared or any night thereafter. Not, you might think, and investigators did think, and some members of the public have thought, that this could simply mean the search missed something. That the terrain is difficult enough, vast enough, that evidence could exist and simply not have been found. And that's technically true. It's possible. But experienced search and rescue professionals will tell you that when you deploy the kind of resources that were deployed in this search, the dogs, the helicopters, the ground teams, and you find absolutely nothing in an area of that size, it means something. It doesn't prove anything definitively, but it means something. What it most strongly suggests that Elaine Park was not in those hills, which raises an immediate and deeply unsettling question. If she wasn't there, why was her car there? There are essentially 2 explanations for why a person's car would be found in a location where the person themselves cannot be found. The first is that the person drove the car there, and then traveled away from the area by some other means, on foot in a direction the searches didn't cover, in another vehicle, with another person. The second is that the car was driven there by someone else, and left there deliberately, as a kind of misdirection. Both of these explanations are disturbing in their own ways. The first requires us to imagine Elaine, upset and possibly in emotional distress, driving to this isolated stretch of highway in the middle of the night and then, what? Getting into another car. Walking somewhere in a direction no one thought to look. It raises as many questions as it answers. The second explanation, that someone else drove the car there, is, if true, evidence of something far more sinister. It implies planning. It implies concealment. It implies that whoever was responsible for Elaine's disappearance thought carefully about how to make it look like something it wasn't. Investigators examined the car carefully for forensic evidence that might tell them which of these scenarios was more likely. What they found, or rather, what has been reported about what they found, has been somewhat limited in terms of public disclosure. This is not unusual in active missing persons investigations, where law enforcement often holds back details to avoid compromising future prosecutions, or to preserve the integrity of the investigation. But the lack of public information has been a source of ongoing frustration for Elaine's family, and for the community of people following the case. What has been reported is that the car did not show obvious signs of a violent struggle. There was no blood reported inside the vehicle. The car was simply parked, unlocked, with her belongings inside, as though she had stepped out for a moment and was coming right back. That image is haunting in its ordinariness. Her phone on the seat, her wallet nearby, her keys. All the things that tether a person to their life, left behind like she had simply forgotten them, or like she hadn't been given the choice. Camelia Park has spoken in interviews about the condition of the car and what she believed it meant. She has been consistent in her the evidence, or the lack of it, did not support the narrative that Elaine had simply wandered away voluntarily. A young woman in emotional distress, leaving after an argument, does not typically leave her phone behind. Her phone was her connection to her mother, to her friends, to the people she loved. Even in the worst moments of emotional pain, most people hold on to that connection. They reach for it, not away from it, the phone being left in the car. That detail has never stopped bothering Camelia. It has never stopped bothering a lot of people who have followed this case closely. Let's talk about the phone records, because this is where the story starts to get complicated in ways that the simple narrative of a young woman in distress walking into the mountains doesn't adequately explain. In the hours after Elaine left Calabasas, sometime in the early morning hours of January 28th, there was activity on her phone. Text messages were sent. The specific content of those messages has not been fully disclosed. But what has been reported is that there was communication occurring in the period between when she left her boyfriend's house and when her phone went silent. That communication window, however brief, is significant because it means that for some period of time after she drove away from Calabasas, Elaine was still in contact with the world, still reachable, still present, and then, at some point, the communication stopped. The timing of when her phone went silent, relative to when her car was found, relative to the known location of her phone based on cell tower data, is one of the pieces of information that investigators have been working with. Cell tower data can give you a rough geographic range for where a phone was when it pinged a particular tower, though it is not precise enough to give you an exact location. What the cell tower data reportedly showed was that Elaine's phone was active in the general area, consistent with the Calabasas and western Los Angeles County region in the hours after she left, which would be consistent with her driving in the area where her car was eventually found. But again, the specific details of what the records showed have not been fully made public. What we do know is that at some point, the phone went silent. And when it was found, days later, it was sitting in her car on Mullen Highway. Whether she left it there, whether someone put it there, whether it died or was turned off, these are questions that remain unanswered in the public record. Now let's talk about the boyfriend. Because in any missing persons case, investigators look first and hardest at the people closest to the victim. This is not cynicism, it is statistics. The vast majority of violent crimes against women are committed by people known to the victim, often by intimate partners. This is a documented, consistent, deeply troubling reality that law enforcement is trained to operate within. When a young woman disappears after an argument with her boyfriend, investigators are going to look at that boyfriend. They have to. Gabe has been questioned by investigators. He has, by various accounts, cooperated with law enforcement to some degree. But Camelia Park has publicly expressed her belief that the investigation into him was not thorough enough, not aggressive enough, not persistent enough. She has raised questions about the timeline of events on the night Elaine disappeared. Questions about what exactly happened during the argument, about how Gabe behaved in the hours and days after Elaine left, about whether his account of events has been fully and rigorously tested. It is important to state clearly, as Camelia herself has sometimes stated, that we do not know what happened. We do not know who is responsible, or whether anyone is responsible in the way we might be imagining. Elaine Park's case is officially classified as a missing persons case, and no one has been charged with any crime in connection with her disappearance. The questions about Gabe are questions, not accusations. They are the natural and necessary questions that arise when a young woman disappears after leaving a man's home, and when the circumstances of that departure and its aftermath don't feel entirely clear. But the questions exist, and they persist, and they deserve to be asked. There are specific things about the timeline in the immediate aftermath of Elaine's disappearance that have troubled people close to the case. When exactly was Camelia notified that her daughter had left? When did Gabe first attempt to contact Elaine after she drove away? When did he notify anyone that she was missing? These seem like basic questions, and in some respects they are, but the answers to them have not been fully consistent or fully clear in the public record. And that inconsistency is something investigators and Elaine's family have had to contend with. Camellia has spoken about discovering that her daughter was missing not through any direct notification from Gabe, but through the absence of Elaine's daily phone call. That daily call, the one that never came on the morning of January 29th, was Camellia's first indication that something was wrong. Not a call from Gabe saying, "Elaine left last night and I haven't heard from her." Just silence. Just the absence of her daughter's voice. How long does a person wait after their girlfriend leaves upset in the middle of the night before they reach out to check on her? Before they call her family? Before they report her missing? These are questions without objectively correct answers. People handle these situations differently. Emotions run high after arguments. There is a natural human tendency to assume things will work themselves out. But in hindsight, in the context of what happened, every hour of delay feels significant. Every hour that passed without someone raising an alarm was an hour in which the trail grew colder. By the time a missing persons report was filed, which happened after Camellia became alarmed by the lack of contact and began trying to locate her daughter, a significant amount of time had passed since Elaine was last seen. And in missing persons cases, time is everything. The first 24 to 48 hours are critical. After that, the chances of finding someone alive, of finding fresh evidence, of tracking a trail that hasn't been obscured by time and weather and the movement of the world, they diminish with every passing hour. The delay in this case is something that has never been fully resolved, never been fully accounted for, and it remains one of the things that most haunts the people who have been following this case and fighting for answers. Let's step back for a moment from the immediate investigation and talk about the broader landscape of the case. Because there are things about the context surrounding Elaine's disappearance that investigators and researchers have considered carefully, and that change the shape of the story when you know them. The Santa Monica Mountains, Malibu Creek State Park, Mulholland Highway. This area, as I mentioned earlier, has a history that goes beyond Elaine Park's disappearance. A history of violence, a history of darkness in the hills. In the late 2010s, there were a series of incidents in and around Malibu Creek State Park that terrified the local camping community and ultimately led to a significant criminal investigation. Between 2016 and 2018, there were multiple reported shootings targeting people camping in the park. Shots fired in the dark at tents, at campers who come to enjoy the natural beauty of the mountains. People were injured. In June 2018, a man named Tristan Boudet was shot and killed while sleeping in a tent with his 2 young daughters, who were unharmed. The shooting was terrifying not just for its violence but for its apparent randomness. A man murdered in his tent in a state park, his children sleeping beside him. No apparent motive, no warning, no explanation. The investigation into those shootings eventually led to the arrest of a man named Anthony Rhoda, a transient who had been living in the hills of the Santa Monica Mountains for an extended period of time. Rhoda was charged with Boudet's murder and with multiple other shooting incidents in the area. He was convicted in 2022 of the murder of Tristan Boudet and sentenced to life in prison. Now, here is where it gets complicated, and where the connection to Elaine Park's case becomes something investigators and researchers have taken seriously. Anthony Rhoda was living in the hills of the Santa Monica Mountains during the period that included January 2017, the time of Elaine Park's disappearance. He was in the area. He was, apparently, capable of extreme violence. He had been charged with multiple shooting incidents spanning a period of years, and the area where Elaine's car was found sits within or adjacent to the territory where Rhoda was known to have been active. Does this mean Rhoda was responsible for whatever happened to Elaine? No. There is no evidence that directly links him to her disappearance. Investigators have reportedly looked at the possible connection and have not, as far as public reporting indicates, established one definitively. But the proximity, geographic and temporal, is not something that can simply be dismissed. A violent, armed individual was living in the hills near where Elaine's car was found during the period when she disappeared. That is a fact. What it means for this case is something investigators have had to grapple with. The Rhoda connection has been explored by journalists, by investigators, and by the community of researchers who have dedicated themselves to understanding what happened to Elaine. Her mother has been aware of it and has weighed it alongside the other questions and possibilities that surround the case. It represents one thread in a complicated tangle, not a definitive answer, but a possibility that cannot be ruled out. And there are other threads, other questions, other details that don't fit neatly into any single narrative. There is the question of why Elaine's car ended up where it did. Calabasas, where she was last seen, and the stretch of Mulholland Highway where her car was found are separated by a relatively short distance, those 7 or 8 miles I mentioned earlier. But the drive from one to the other is not a direct or obvious one. It requires making specific turns, going in a specific direction, ending up on a specific road. If Elaine drove there herself, what drew her to that particular location? If someone else drove the car there? Why that spot? Was it a location she knew? A place she had been before? A road she had driven on with her boyfriend, perhaps? Or was it simply the nearest isolated spot where a car could be left and a person could disappear into the darkness? These questions haven't been answered. They may never be answered. But they are the questions that keep Camellia Park awake at night. They are the questions that have driven her to keep fighting. Keep pushing, keep refusing to let her daughter's case fade into the background of the many unsolved disappearances that haunt this city and this country. Let's talk about Camellia, because she deserves to be recognized not just as Elaine's mother, but as a force in her own right, a woman who has turned unimaginable grief into relentless action. In the weeks and months after Elaine disappeared, Camellia became the public face of the search for her daughter. She gave interviews. She organized search parties. She connected with other families of missing persons. She navigated the painful, bureaucratic, often deeply inadequate machinery of the missing persons system in the United States, a system that, as many families in her position have discovered, is far more limited and far less responsive than most people imagine it to be. She learned things in this process that no mother should have to learn. She learned that in the United States, missing persons cases, particularly those involving adults, often receive far less investigative and resources than cases involving violent crime. She learned that the presumption of voluntary disappearance, once made, can be maddeningly difficult to overcome. She learned that without physical evidence of foul play, without a body, without witnesses to a crime, law enforcement's ability to aggressively pursue a case is significantly constrained. She also learned something that broke her heart in a specific and particular way: that missing persons of color, missing women of color, are systematically underrepresented in media coverage and in the allocation of investigative resources relative to white victims. This is a documented phenomenon, sometimes called missing white woman syndrome, in the research literature, a term that describes the disproportionate media attention and public concern generated by cases involving young, white, conventionally attractive women compared to cases involving victims of color, regardless of the equally compelling human dimensions of those cases. Elaine Park was a young Korean-American woman. Her case received some media attention, more than many missing persons cases, in part because of her mother's tireless advocacy, and in part because the details of the case were genuinely compelling and mysterious. But it received nothing like the wall-to-wall coverage that comparable cases involving white victims have received. Camellia has spoken about this disparity with pain and frustration. Her daughter was just as beautiful, just as loved, just as deserving of attention and resources and answers as any victim, whose case has dominated the national news cycle. The fact that Elaine's case did not receive that level of attention is something Camellia has refused to accept quietly. The community that formed around Elaine's case, people online, researchers, advocates, journalists, has helped fill some of the gap left by insufficient mainstream media coverage. There are people who have spent years following this case, analyzing the available information, conducting their own research, pushing for answers. True crime communities, for all their complexities and the valid criticisms they receive, have in this case served as a real force for keeping Elaine's story alive and for maintaining pressure on investigators and authorities to continue pursuing answers. That community has also surfaced information and analysis that has, at times, pushed the official investigation in new directions. not always in ways that have led to breakthroughs. This is a case that has stubbornly resisted resolution, but in ways that have ensured the case remains open and active, that Elaine Park's name continues to be spoken, that she is not forgotten. Because being forgotten for families of the missing is a specific kind of secondary loss. When the cameras move on and the news cycle shifts and the public attention turns to the next tragedy, the family is left alone with their grief and their questions and the terrible, grinding uncertainty of not knowing. Camelia Park has fought against that erasure with everything she has. And that fight, that love is itself something worth honoring. As the months passed and then the years began to accumulate, the investigation went through several phases. There were periods of intensified activity, new searches, new interviews, new analysis of existing evidence, and periods of apparent quiet. There were moments when it seemed like a breakthrough might be coming. Moments when new information surfaced that seemed potentially significant, moments that ultimately didn't resolve into the answers everyone was hoping for. One of the persistent threads of the investigation has been the examination of surveillance footage from the area where Elaine's car was found and from the roads that connected Calabasas to that location. In the age of ubiquitous cameras, on businesses, on traffic intersections, on private properties, it is often possible to reconstruct at least partial information about a vehicle's movements on a given night. Investigators reportedly were available footage from the area, looking for any sign of Elaine's car or of Elaine herself in the hours after she left Calabasas. What that review revealed, or whether it revealed anything significant, has not been fully disclosed. This is another area where the boundary between what investigators know and what the public knows is not entirely clear. It is possible that footage exists that tells investigators something meaningful about the events of that night. It is also possible that the coverage was insufficient, that the critical moments happened in locations without cameras, that the trail, visual and otherwise, simply wasn't there to follow. The investigation also looked carefully at the people in Elaine's life beyond her boyfriend, her friends, her fellow musicians, people she had been in contact with in the days and weeks before her disappearance. Investigators built a picture of her social world, looking for anyone who might have had a conflict with her, anyone who might have had a reason to want her gone, anyone who might have information about what happened. From what has been reported, nothing in Elaine's wider social circle produced a clear suspect or a clear lead. She was, by all accounts, well-liked and without serious enemies. She was not involved in anything dangerous or criminal. Her world was music and family and friends, and the ordinary struggles of being young and finding your way. Not the kind of world that typically produces the kind of violence that makes someone disappear. Which brings us back always to the night of January 28th, to the argument in Calabasas, to the car parked on Mulholland Highway, to the phone and the wallet and the keys left behind, to the mountains and their silence and their secrets, and to Anthony Rauda, living in those hills, and to all the questions that remain unanswered. The investigation continues. As of the time of this telling, Elaine Park has not been found. Her case remains officially open. Her mother continues to fight for answers, and somewhere in the tangle of evidence and absence and grief and mystery, the truth about what happened to Elaine on that cold January night in 2017 is waiting to be found. We are going to keep looking. Together. There is a particular cruelty and uncertainty. In the landscape of grief, there are many terrible terrains to navigate: the sharp, sudden devastation of confirmed loss, the long, slow ache of absence, the complicated tangle of guilt and memory, and love that survivors carry with them for the rest of their lives. All of these are brutal in their own ways, but there is something uniquely, specifically cruel about not knowing. About waking up every morning and not knowing whether daughter is alive or dead, whether she is suffering somewhere, or at peace, whether there is still something you can do, or whether the time for doing has already passed, whether the next phone call will bring answers, or whether you will go to bed again tonight in the same terrible, suspended state you have been living in for days, weeks, months, years. Camelia Park has been living in that uncertainty since January 29, 2017, every single day, every single morning. That is the reality of what this case has meant for the family Elaine left behind. And it is important, before we go any deeper into the investigative details, the forensic questions, the suspect analysis, to hold that reality for a moment, to acknowledge it, to let it land. Because this is not just a mystery to be solved. This is a family that has been broken open by the disappearance of someone they loved completely. And everything we discuss from here forward exists within that human context, within the weight of that ongoing grief. Now let's go deeper. In the years following Elaine's disappearance, several investigative threads have been pursued with varying degrees of intensity and varying degrees of result. Let's take them one by one, because each one tells us something, even when what it tells us is that we still don't know. The first thread, and perhaps the most persistently troubling one, is the question of what exactly happened in the hours between when Elaine left Calabasas and when her car was found on Mulholland Highway. This is a window of time that, depending on exactly when she left and exactly when the car was abandoned in its final location, could be anywhere from a few hours to potentially longer. And within that window, something happened. Something that resulted in a young woman's disappearance without a trace. Investigators working the case have had access to cell phone data, to potential witness accounts, to surveillance footage from the area, and to the forensic evidence from the car itself. They have, presumably, built some picture of that window of time, even if it is an incomplete one. But the public record on this specific period is thin. The details that have emerged in dribs and drabs through media reporting and through statements from Elaine's family paint an outline, but not a complete picture. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: Elaine's phone was active for some period after she left Calabasas. Text messages were sent. Whether those messages were sent by Elaine herself, or whether someone else had access to her phone and was sending messages from it, is a question that has not been definitively resolved in the public record. This is an important distinction. The difference between a phone being used by its owner and a phone being used by someone else is significant. It is the difference between Elaine being alive and communicative for some period after she left the house, versus someone else controlling the narrative being communicated through her device. The content of those messages, who they were sent to, what they said, whether they were consistent with Elaine's voice and manner of communication, has not been fully disclosed. But the fact that investigators have examined them closely, and the fact that questions about those messages have surfaced in discussions of the case, suggests that they are not entirely straightforward, that there is something about them that required careful examination. Let's talk about the physical search in more depth, because the geography of this case is important in ways that go beyond the immediate area around the car. Malibu Creek State Park, where the search is concentrated, is one part of a much larger natural area. The Santa Monica Mountains stretch from the western edge of Los Angeles all the way to passing dozens of distinct parks, preserves, and wilderness areas connected by trails and fire roads and the winding arteries of Mulholland Drive and Mulholland Highway. It is possible, theoretically possible, to travel significant distances through this landscape on foot, through terrain that varies from relatively accessible trails to genuine wilderness that demands serious technical skill to navigate. The searches for Elaine focused primarily on the area immediately adjacent to where her car was found, and on the accessible portions of Malibu Creek State Park in that vicinity. But the mountains extend well beyond those areas, and the full scope of the terrain was never comprehensively searched, not because investigators were negligent, but because the sheer scale of the landscape makes comprehensive search impossible with the resources typically available to a missing persons investigation. This means that the absence of evidence in the searched areas, while significant, is not a definitive answer. There are places in those mountains where evidence could exist, and where no one has yet looked. This is a painful reality that Camellia Park has had to live with. The knowledge that her daughter could be somewhere in that vast, beautiful, indifferent landscape, and that finding her would require resources and coordination that have not yet been fully mobilized. There have been additional searches over the years. Volunteers have gone out. New searches have been organized as new information or new analyses have suggested areas that might not have been thoroughly covered in earlier efforts. Each search has been undertaken with hope and has ended with the same terrible emptiness. Nothing found. No answers given. The mountains keeping their silence. But let's talk now about the aspect of this case that, for many people following it, represents the most significant and disturbing dimension of the investigation. Let's talk about Anthony Rada more carefully, because the possible connection between his presence in the Santa Monica Mountains and Elaine Park's disappearance is something that deserves serious and careful examination. Anthony Rada was, by the time of his arrest in October 2019, a man who had been living essentially off the grid in the hills of the Santa Monica Mountains for a significant period of time. He had no fixed address. He foraged and hunted and camped in the wilderness areas of the mountains, moving through the landscape in ways that were largely invisible to the outside world. He was armed. He was, the evidence would eventually show, capable of extraordinary violence, of firing shots at sleeping people in tents in the dark, of committing the kind of random, apparently unmotivated violence that is among the most terrifying categories of human behavior, because it is so difficult to predict or prevent. When Rada was arrested, investigators began the process of reviewing the full scope of his activities in the mountains over the years he had been living there. This review encompassed not just the shooting incidents for which he was eventually charged, but a broader examination of the period and the area in which he had been active. And within that review, the question of whether his presence in the mountains overlapped in any meaningful way with Elaine Park's disappearance became something that investigators and researchers considered seriously. The timeline is uncomfortable. Rada was in the mountains in January 2017. He was in the general area where Elaine's car was found. He was armed and had demonstrated, over the course of his time in the mountains, a willingness to commit violence against strangers. If Elaine had somehow encountered Rada in that isolated stretch of highway or in the hills nearby, if she had gotten out of her car and he had been in the area, the potential consequences of that encounter are something terrible to contemplate. But here is where the careful examination of the evidence becomes important, because the connection between Rada and Elaine's disappearance is not established. It is a possibility, one that has been seriously considered, but it is not a confirmed fact. Investigators have looked at it and have not, based on available reporting, established a definitive link. This could mean there is no link. It could mean that the evidence connecting them simply doesn't exist in a form that can be proven. It could mean that the investigation of that connection is ongoing. What it means for our understanding of the case is that Rada represents one possible explanation among several, a terrifying one, but not the only one and not a confirmed one. There are researchers who have gone deep into the geography and the timeline and have argued, with varying degrees of conviction, that the Rada connection is highly plausible, that the combination of his known presence in the area, his documented propensity for violence, and the specific location where Elaine's car was found creates a compelling circumstantial case for his involvement. There are others who have focused more heavily on the circumstances of Elaine's departure from Calabasas, on the argument with her boyfriend, on the timeline questions, on the behavior in the aftermath, and have argued that the most likely explanation lies closer to home, in the relationships and dynamics that existed in Elaine's immediate life. Both of these perspectives represent serious analytical engagement with the available evidence. Neither has been definitived or definitively ruled out, and in the absence of a body, without a definitive forensic finding, the case remains in that painful suspended state, open, unsolved, unresolved. Let's talk for a moment about the broader landscape of missing persons in the Santa Monica Mountains area, because Elaine's case does not exist in isolation. There have been other disappearances, other deaths, other cases in this stretch of hills and coastline that have gone unexplained or only partially explained. And the pattern of these cases, the accumulation of them, tells us something about the area and about the kinds of dangers it has historically harbored. We have discussed the Rada shooting cases, but there are others. People who have gone into the mountains and not come back. Hikers found dead under circumstances that were ruled accidental, but that left questions. Young people whose disappearances were classified as voluntary or as accidents and whose families have never been entirely convinced by those classifications. The Santa Monica Mountains are beautiful and wild, and they have, over the years, been the setting for a disproportionate number of unexplained and troubling events. This is not to suggest a serial killer lurking in every shadow, or a vast criminal conspiracy operating in the hills. Most of what happens in wilderness areas can be explained by the ordinary dangers of rugged terrain, by accidents, by the vulnerability of people who underestimate what the natural world demands of them. But the accumulation of cases in this specific area, the density of them, the unresolved nature of so many of them, creates a context that is worth acknowledging when we think about what might have happened to Elaine. She disappeared into the edge of that landscape. Whatever happened to her happened there, or began there, and the history of that place is part of the story. Now let's turn to something that has become increasingly significant in the public discussion of this case: the role of social media, of the true crime community, and of the amateur investigation that has taken place in parallel with the official one. In the years since Elaine's disappearance, her case has attracted a dedicated community of researchers and advocates who have invested significant time and energy into analyzing the available information, surfacing new leads, and maintaining public attention on the case. This community has operated primarily through social media platforms, Facebook groups, Reddits, YouTube videos, podcast episodes, and has produced a body of analysis and discussion that is, in some respects, more comprehensive and more accessible than the official investigation, as reflected in public reporting. This community has been, on balance, a force for good in this case. It has kept Elaine's name alive. It has produced analysis that has at times identified angles and questions that weren't immediately apparent in mainstream reporting. It has provided a space for people who care about the case to connect, to share information, to support Camellia in the broader effort to find answers. But it has also at times caused harm. The nature of open source investigation is that it operates without the legal and ethical constraints that govern official law enforcement, and without the verification mechanisms that responsible journalism requires. People have been named publicly as suspects without evidence sufficient to justify those allegations. Theories have been promoted with a confidence that the underlying evidence doesn't warrant. Harassment of individuals connected to the case has occurred. These are real consequences, and they are worth acknowledging alongside the genuine contributions the community has made. The relationship between amateur investigation and official investigation in high-profile missing persons cases is a complex one. At its best, the amateur community surfaces information and analysis that helps investigators, that provides leads they hadn't considered, that identifies witnesses who hadn't come forward, that keeps public pressure on institutions that might otherwise deprioritize a case. At its worst, it can compromise investigations by tipping off subjects, contaminating witness memories, and creating legal complications that make prosecution harder. In Elaine's case, the overall arc of the amateur investigation has been more helpful than harmful in the assessment of most observers. It has served Camellia's interests by keeping the case in public consciousness. It has produced analysis that investigators have, in some instances, reportedly taken seriously. And it has ensured that Elaine Park is not forgotten, that her case is not one of the many thousands of missing persons files that simply languish in the system without anyone outside the family continuing to push for resolution. Now let's go back to the relationship between Elaine and Gabe, because there are specific details that have emerged in the investigation that deserve careful examination. The argument that preceded Elaine's departure, the argument that, in some ways, set the events of that night in motion, has been described in various terms by various people. What has been consistently reported is that it was serious enough to prompt Elaine to leave in the middle of the night, upset and alone. The content of the argument, the specific issues at stake, the emotional temperature of what transpired between them, these details have not been fully disclosed. What investigators reportedly focused on, in their examination of the relationship and the events of that night, was the question of whether the argument was the kind of ordinary relationship conflict that ends with someone leaving angrily and then coming home the next day, or whether it was something more serious, something that might have escalated beyond the bounds of what Elaine could safely navigate alone. This is a delicate question to examine, because it involves assessing the private dynamics of a relationship from the outside, with incomplete information, in the emotionally charged context of a disappearance. It requires holding several things simultaneously: the genuine possibility that the argument was ordinary, and that something entirely was responsible for what happened to Elaine. The genuine possibility that the dynamics of the relationship played a role in what happened, and the responsibility not to convict someone in the court of public opinion without evidence sufficient to support that conviction. Camelia Park has been careful in her public statements to balance these considerations. She has raised questions. She has expressed frustration with the investigation. She has pointed to specific aspects of the timeline and the behavior in the aftermath that she finds troubling. But she has also consistently said that what she wants most is answers, not retribution, not the satisfaction of blame assigned, but the truth of what happened to her daughter. Whatever that truth is, that orientation, the focus on truth rather than on a predetermined conclusion, is something worth recognizing and honoring in Camelia's advocacy. She has been a fierce and tireless fighter for her daughter's memory, and she has conducted that fight with a clarity of purpose and a commitment to truth that is genuinely admirable. The investigation of Gabe has included, according to various reports, interviews, examination of his phone records and communications, review of his whereabouts in the period after Elaine left his home, an assessment of his behavior in the immediate aftermath of her disappearance. The results of that investigation, as reflected in the public record, have not produced criminal charges. Whether that is because the investigation found nothing to support the possibility of his involvement, or because the evidence is insufficient to meet the threshold for charges, even if suspicion exists, or because the investigation is ongoing and incomplete, these are distinctions that the public record does not clearly answer. What the public record does show is that Elaine's disappearance happened in a context, a relationship, an argument, a night departure into darkness, that investigators would be professionally obligated to examine seriously, and that examination has taken place. What it has and hasn't produced remains, in significant part, unknown to the public. Let's shift now to think about the forensic dimensions of this case in a different way. Not just what investigators found or didn't find, but what the absence of findings tells us about the nature of what happened. In most cases where a person is killed and their body is concealed, there are traces. The work of concealment is imperfect. The natural world is not a compliant accomplice. Soil gives up bones eventually, animals disturb concealed remains, hikers stumble across things in the wilderness that shouldn't be there. Time, weather, erosion, all of these work against perfect concealment. And yet, in Elaine Park's case, years of searching have produced nothing, no remains, no personal items, no trace. This could mean several things. It could mean that the searches have simply not reached the right location, that whatever remains exist are in an area that hasn't been searched, or hasn't been searched thoroughly enough. The Santa Monica Mountains, as we've discussed, are vast, and comprehensive coverage is genuinely difficult. It could mean that whatever happened to Elaine didn't happen in the mountains at all, that the car was left there as misdirection, and that she or her remains are somewhere else entirely, somewhere the search has never focused. It could mean, and this is the possibility that some families of the missing eventually have to reckon with, that the remains are in a location or condition that makes recovery extremely unlikely. Each of these possibilities is devastating in its own way. The first holds out hope that a properly directed future search might bring Elaine home to her family. The second raises the terrifying question of where else she might be, and why the car was there if she wasn't. The third confronts us with the possibility that even if we eventually understand what happened to Elaine, we may never be able to bring her home physically, that the answer to the mystery and the closure of her return may be two separate things that don't come together. For Camellia, the priority has always been clear: she wants her daughter. She wants to know what happened. She wants to bring Elaine home. She wants to look at the person or people responsible for whatever happened and have the justice system hold them accountable. She wants all of these things simultaneously, and she has never stopped fighting for all of them. Now let's talk about what happened in 2022. Because that year brought a development that changed the shape of the public conversation around this case in a significant way. In 2022, Anthony Rada was convicted of the murder of Tristan Boudet. The conviction confirmed what investigators had suspected, that this man had been living violently in the Santa Monica Mountains for years, committing random acts of violence against strangers who had the misfortune to encounter him in that isolated landscape. And with the conviction came renewed attention to the question of what else Rada might have done during his years in the hills. What other crimes, what other victims, might be connected to his presence there. Investigators working on the Rada case reportedly examined other unsolved cases from the area and the time period to assess potential connections. Whether that examination produced any significant findings regarding Elaine Park specifically has not been definitively reported. But the renewed attention brought by the conviction did reignite public interest in the case and prompted a fresh wave of analysis and discussion in the community of people following it. It also prompted renewed calls for Elaine's case to be examined in light of what was now known about Rada, for investigators to take seriously the possibility that his presence in the mountains in January 2017 might be relevant to understanding what happened to her. Whether those calls have produced any new investigative action, and whether that action has produced any new findings, is something the public record does not yet fully reflect. What the Rada conviction did, perhaps most importantly, was confirm something that families and researchers had been insisting for years, that the Santa Monica Mountains, for all their beauty, had been harboring serious and violent danger, that the area where Elaine's car was found was not simply a scenic backdrop for a mysterious disappearance. It was an area with a documented history of violence, that the wilderness can be dangerous in ways that are easy to underestimate when you're looking at it from the outside, from the safety of your car window or your comfortable home. That validation, painful as it is, coming so long after the fact, matters for how we understand Elaine's case. It doesn't resolve it, but it places it in a context that makes certain possibilities more credible and more worthy of serious investigation than they might have seemed without it. Let's also talk about the way the case has intersected with the broader conversation about missing and murdered Indigenous women, women of color, and the systemic failures of the justice system in responding to their disappearances. Because Elaine's case is not just a story about one young woman. It is a story that connects to a much larger and more troubling pattern. In the United States, thousands of people go missing every year. The majority of them are eventually found, returned home, located alive, their disappearances explained by the ordinary chaos of human life. But a significant number remain missing for extended periods, and a subset of those cases remain permanently unresolved. The distribution of those unresolved cases is not random. It correlates with race, with socioeconomic status, with the demographics of who gets covered by the media and who gets treated as a priority by law enforcement. Women of color are disproportionately represented among the long-term missing. Their cases receive less media coverage, less investigative resources, less public attention than comparable cases involving white victims. This is not a controversial finding. It has been documented extensively by researchers, by journalists, by advocates who work in this space. It is a systemic failure with real consequences for real families, families like Camellia Parks, who are fighting for answers in cases that the broader system has deprioritized. Elaine's case has, in some measure, benefited from the attention of the true crime community and from her mother's tireless advocacy in ways that have compensated for the systemic disadvantages she faced as a woman of color. But that compensation is partial and imperfect, and the systemic inequities remain. They remain for Elaine's case and for the many other cases of missing women of color that receive far less attention and produce far fewer answers. These are hard truths to sit with, They don't make the investigation of Elaine's case any easier or any more tractable, but they are part of the context in which the story exists, and they deserve to be named. As we move forward into the next phase of our examination of this case, let's hold in mind everything we've covered so far. The peaceful life Elaine was building, the night she drove away into the darkness, the car found empty on Mulholland Highway, the searches that found nothing, the questions about the relationship, the timeline, the behavior, and the aftermath, the violent man living in the hills nearby, the systemic failures that have made this case harder to solve and harder to keep in public consciousness. And through all of it, the figure of Camelia Park. Relentless, grieving, fighting. We are going to keep examining this case. We are going to look at the specific details that investigators have focused on in the years since 2017. We are going to look at the theories, all of them carefully, and we are going to think together about what the evidence most strongly suggests. Because Elaine Park deserves that. She deserves the full weight of our attention, our care, our determination to understand what happened to her. And her mother deserves to know that the world has not forgotten her daughter, that there are people out here in the quiet hours, listening and thinking and caring about the answer. Let's keep going. The thing about cold cases, and while Elaine's case is still officially active and open, the passage of years has given it some of the characteristics of a cold case, is that they have a rhythm of intensity and quiet, of renewed attention and settling back into the background noise of unresolved things. In the immediate aftermath of a disappearance, there is urgency. Resources are deployed. Media covers it. The public pays attention. And then gradually, as no resolution comes, the urgency fades and the case settles into a lower level of activity, still pursued, still open, but no longer at the front of anyone's priority list except the family's. Elaine's case has followed that rhythm, with some variations. There have been periods of renewed intensity. The discovery of her car, the searches, the Rado arrest and conviction, the occasional resurfacing of the case in media coverage. And there have been long stretches of apparent quiet, in which Camelia and the community of people who care about Elaine have had to work to maintain attention and momentum. In those quiet stretches, what has continued is the accumulation of analysis. The patient, careful work of people who have gone over the available information again and again, looking for something that might have been missed, thinking about the case from different angles, asking questions that haven't yet been asked. This work is unglamorous and often frustrating. It rarely produces dramatic breakthroughs, and it is conducted in the knowledge that even well-directed analysis may not be enough to crack a case that has resisted resolution for this long. But it continues, because Elaine Park is worth continuing for. One of the analytical threads that has been pursued by researchers over the years is the question of the drive itself, the drive from Calabasas to Mulholland Highway. Investigators and researchers have attempted to reconstruct the most likely route that a person driving from Gabe's home in Calabasas would take to reach the spot where Elaine's car was found. The most direct road involves driving south on Las Virgenes Road, and then turning onto Mulholland Highway, a fairly straightforward drive, one that a person familiar with the area would naturally take. The question of whether Elaine knew this area, whether she had driven on Mulholland Highway before, whether there was any reason specific to her knowledge or history that might explain why she or her car ended up there, has been considered. Calabasas is close to this stretch of the Santa Monica Mountains, and someone who lived or spent time there would potentially be familiar with the roads. But whether Elaine specifically had any connection to that particular stretch of highway is not something that has emerged clearly in the public record. The drive itself takes a relatively short amount of time. From Calabasas to the spot where the car was found is perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, depending on the specific origin and destination points. That is a very short window, a window in which something dramatic had to have happened, or in which a decision was made about where to go and what to do. What was Elaine thinking during those 15 or 20 minutes? Was she driving in distress, looking for somewhere to pull over and collect herself? Was she heading somewhere specific? To meet someone or to be alone with her thoughts in a place she knew? Was she being followed? Was she with someone in the car who directed where she went? We don't know. We may never know. But the questions are worth sitting with, because they capture the terrible intimacy of those final documented moments of her life. The smallness of the window between her leaving Calabasas and her car appearing on that highway, the way so much must have happened in so short a time. There is a theory, one that has circulated among researchers and investigators, and the community of people who have spent years thinking about this case, that deserves careful examination. Not because it is definitively true, not because the evidence conclusively supports it, but because it represents a coherent and interpretation of the available facts, one that serious people have taken seriously, and one that helps us understand the range of possibilities that investigators have had to navigate. The theory goes like this: Elaine Park did not drive herself to Mulholland Highway. Or rather, she may have started the drive, may have been behind the wheel when she left Calabasas, but something happened during that drive that changed everything. Something that resulted in her car being parked in that isolated spot with her belongings inside and her body nowhere to be found. Something that involved another person. This theory, which exists in several variations depending on who is articulating it and what specific evidence they are emphasizing, essentially posits that Elaine did not disappear voluntarily, did not walk into the mountains of her own accord, and did not harm herself. It posits instead that she encountered someone, or was brought somewhere against her will. That whatever happened to her was done to her, not by her. This is, of course, the theory that her mother has never stopped believing. The theory that Camellia Park has fought for, sometimes against the apparent assumptions of investigators, always against the passage of time and the fading of public attention. It is the theory that says Elaine's story is not a tragedy of mental illness or accident or misadventure, but a crime. A crime committed against a young woman who did nothing to deserve it, and who had everything to live for. Let's examine this theory carefully and honestly, looking at what supports it and what complicates it. What supports the theory that something criminal happened to Elaine Park? First and most powerfully, the belongings left in the car. We have returned to this detail again and again, and we will continue to return to it, because it is genuinely the most significant single piece of evidence in this case. Her phone, her wallet, her keys, the things without which a person cannot function in the modern world, the things that a person in emotional distress, even severe emotional distress, even suicidal distress, almost never voluntarily abandons. Because those items represent connection. The phone connects you to the people you love. The wallet represents the ability to survive, to buy food, to get help. The keys represent mobility, the ability to change your mind and go somewhere else. People who genuinely intend to harm themselves typically do not leave these items behind in a way that suggests careful, deliberate arrangement. And people who are simply overwhelmed and need to clear their head, who pull over somewhere and sit with their thoughts, don't typically get out of the car and walk away leaving everything behind. The arrangement of Elaine's belongings in that car speaks most powerfully to one of two scenarios. Either she left them deliberately, in a way that suggests something planned and intentional that her family and friends are convinced is inconsistent with who she was, or she didn't leave them at all. Someone else arranged them there. Second, the complete absence of any trace of Elaine in the searched areas. As we've discussed, experienced search and rescue professionals will tell you that comprehensive searches of the kind conducted in the aftermath of Elaine's disappearance typically produce something. A footprint, a piece of clothing, a biological trace. The fact that the searches found absolutely nothing is, to trained eyes, significant. It suggests Elaine wasn't there to leave a trace, which in turn suggests she wasn't in the mountains at all, which in turn raises the question of what the car was doing there if she wasn't. Third, the timeline questions. The gaps and inconsistencies in the account of what happened that night. Questions about when the alarm was raised, about what communications occurred and when, about the behavior of people in Elaine's immediate circle in the hours after she disappeared. These don't prove criminal activity, but they create a picture that is difficult to fully reconcile with a simple account of a young woman in distress driving away into the night. Fourth, the character evidence. Everyone who knew Elaine Park, her mother, her friends, her fellow musicians, the people who were part of her daily life, has consistently said the same thing. She was not someone who would simply disappear. She was someone who called her mother every day. She was someone who was engaged with her life, with her music, with her relationships, and her future. The idea that she voluntarily walked away from all of that, even in a moment of emotional pain, is something the people who loved her cannot square with who she was. Now let's look at what complicates this theory. Because intellectual honesty requires us to look at the complications as well as the supports. The most significant complication is that we don't have a body, and we don't have direct physical evidence of a crime. In the absence of those things, all of our theorizing, however well reasoned, however carefully constructed, remains in the realm of interpretation. We are reading the negative space, drawing conclusions from what isn't there rather than from what is. And while that kind of analysis can be valuable, it has limits. It can lead us to conclusions that feel compelling and are ultimately wrong. The second complication is the mental health context. Elaine was struggling. She had been dealing with depression and anxiety. She had been seeking help. These facts don't make her disappearance any more or less likely to be the result of a crime. Mental health struggles are not predictors of suicidality or a voluntary disappearance in any straightforward way. But they do mean that we have to be careful about dismissing the possibility that her emotional state on that night played a role in what happened. Even as we hold firm to what the people who knew her have said about the nature of that emotional state. The third complication is the existence of the Radha possibility, which complicates the picture not because it makes the case simpler, but because it adds another layer of uncertainty. If Radha was responsible, then the dynamics of Elaine's relationship and the argument with her boyfriend become largely irrelevant to understanding what happened to her. The crime was random, horrifying, committed by a stranger with no connection to her life. And while that possibility is in some ways easier for her family to hold, easier than believing someone she loved was responsible, it is also, in its own way, deeply terrible. Because it means she was taken by pure chance, by being in the wrong place at the wrong, that harbored a danger she had no way to know about. The fourth complication is simply the passage of time. 6-7 years have elapsed since Elaine disappeared. Evidence debris shift. Witnesses become harder to find and harder to interview. Physical traces that might have existed in the immediate aftermath are long gone. The window for certain kinds of investigation, particularly the kinds that depend on fresh evidence and fresh memories, has been closing for years. This doesn't mean the case can't be solved. Cold cases are solved all the time, often through the patient accumulation of information over years, through the eventual willingness of someone who knows something to come forward, through advances in forensic technology that make previously unanalyzable evidence newly meaningful. But it does mean that the task of solving it becomes harder with every passing year. Let's talk now about the specific investigative steps that have been taken in more recent years. Because the investigation has not stood still even as it has struggled to produce results. In the years following Elaine's disappearance, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, which has jurisdiction over the area where her car was found, has maintained the case as an active missing persons investigation. Investigators have periodically reviewed the case, conducted additional interviews, and revisited the evidence in light of new information. The Radha arrest and conviction in 2019 and 2022 respectively prompted investigators to look again at the case in the context of what was now known about his activities in the mountains. Camellia Park has maintained ongoing communication with investigators and has periodically met with them to discuss the status of the investigation and to provide any new information she has gathered through her own research and advocacy. These meetings have, by her account, been variably productive, sometimes leaving her with a sense that investigators are genuinely engaged and that progress is being made, and sometimes leaving her with the frustrating feeling that the case is not receiving the priority it deserves. She has also connected with advocates and organizations that work specifically on behalf of families of the missing, organizations that provide resources, that help navigate the law enforcement system, that assist with media outreach and public awareness campaigns. This network of support has been invaluable to her in maintaining the energy and focus required to keep fighting year after year. The community of online researchers and investigators has continued its work as well, periodically surfacing new analyses, new observations, new questions about specific aspects of the case that haven't been publicly resolved. Some of this work has been serious and careful and genuinely analytical. Some of it has been less rigorous and has contributed to the spread of speculation that may not be well-founded. As with any high-profile unsolved case, separating the signal from the noise in the community discussion is a constant challenge. One thread of research that has been particularly significant involves the geographic analysis of the area where Elaine's car was found, specifically, attempts to map the terrain and identify locations within reasonable distance of the car that might not have been covered in the initial searches. Researchers have used satellite imagery, topographic maps, and knowledge of the terrain to identify areas that may have been overlooked or underexplored, and have advocated for those areas to be included in future search efforts. This kind of analysis, patient, methodical, using available technology to think carefully about a problem that brute force searching hasn't been able to solve, represents the best of what the amateur research community can contribute. It doesn't replace professional investigation, but it can supplement it and focus it in ways that are genuinely helpful. There is also a thread of investigation that has focused on the question of whether any surveillance footage exists from the night of Elaine's disappearance that hasn't yet been reviewed or publicly disclosed. Footage from cameras along the road between Calabasas and Mulholland Highway, from businesses or residences in the area, from traffic monitoring systems. The density of surveillance infrastructure in the Los Angeles area is significant, and it is possible that cameras captured something relevant that hasn't yet been fully analyzed. Whether investigators have exhausted the available surveillance footage is not something the public record makes entirely clear. The resources required to comprehensively review all available footage from a given night in an urban and suburban area are substantial, and it is possible that not every potentially relevant camera was reviewed in the initial investigation. As technology has improved and as facial recognition and license plate recognition systems have become more capable, there may be value in revisiting this avenue even years after the fact. Let's talk about something that doesn't come up often enough in discussions of this case: the impact of the disappearance on Elaine's broader community, on her friends, on her fellow musicians, on the people who were part of her world and who have had to continue living in the aftermath of her absence. The disappearance of someone you love, particularly a disappearance without resolution, without explanation, without the terrible but necessary closure of confirmed death and a body to grieve, does something specific and damaging to the people who survive it. It creates what grief counselors sometimes call ambiguous loss, a state of mourning that cannot fully progress because the object of the grief is neither definitively present nor definitively absent. You cannot fully let go because letting go feels like betrayal, like giving up, like deciding the person is gone when you don't actually know that. But you also cannot hold on in any practical sense, because the person is not there to hold on to. This state, this terrible suspended grief, is something Camellia Park has lived in for years. But it is also something that Elaine's friends, her fellow musicians, the people who were close to her in the months before she disappeared, have had to navigate. And they have had to navigate it while also, in many cases, dealing with the additional difficulty of being connected to an unsolved potential crime, being interviewed by investigators, being aware of the speculation that surrounds the case, living under the implicit shadow of unanswered questions about what happened and whether anyone they know was responsible. That is a heavy thing to carry, and it is worth acknowledging, in our examination of this case, that the effects of Elaine's disappearance extend well beyond her immediate family, that the ripples of what happened to her have spread through a community of people who loved her, and that those people deserve acknowledgement and care, alongside the focus on investigation and justice. Elaine's music has taken on a particular poignancy in the years since her disappearance. For those who were lucky enough to hear her play, to sit in a room while she drew that bow across the strings and produced something that went straight to the place behind the price bun, where the deepest feelings lie. The memory of that music is a complicated kind of comfort. It is a reminder of what she was, what she had, what she could do. And it is a reminder of everything that was taken when she disappeared. Music is not lost the way people are lost. It persists. It lives in the memories of people who heard it, in recordings if they exist, in the way it shaped the people who experienced it. Elaine Park's music, whatever recordings exist, whatever memories her fellow musicians carry, is still in the world in some form. Still present in the way that she in person is not. That is a small comfort. But in a case with so few comforts, small ones matter. Now let's move into the territory of the investigation that is most difficult to discuss with appropriate care. The specific individuals who have been looked at in connection with Elaine's disappearance, and what the investigation has and hasn't established about them. We have talked about Gabe. We have talked about the questions surrounding the night of the argument, and the days that followed. Let's think now about what the investigation has involved in terms of specific lines of inquiry, and what the public record tells us about where those lines led. Investigators in missing persons cases conduct what is called a victimology analysis, a systematic examination of the victim's life, relationships, habits, and circumstances that aims to identify factors that might have contributed to their disappearance or that might point toward a perpetrator. In Elaine's case, this analysis would have included an examination of her relationship with Gabe, her wider social network, her family dynamics, her professional relationships in the music world, her mental health history, her financial situation, and any other aspects of her life that might be relevant. The victimology analysis almost certainly confirmed what friends and family have said publicly, that Elaine was not involved in anything criminal or dangerous, that she had no enemies in any conventional sense, that her life was not one that would typically be expected to produce the kind of violence that results in disappearance. This is both reassuring. It tells us that her disappearance was not the result of some hidden dangerous life that no one knew about, and in some ways complicating, because it means the explanation for what happened must be found elsewhere. It means looking at the intimate relationship. It means looking at the location. It means looking at the possibility of random violence from a stranger. And it means holding all of these possibilities simultaneously without letting the desire for a clean answer push us prematurely toward any one of them. The examination of Gabe has been, by various accounts, ongoing and thorough, though Camellia has expressed frustration with what she perceives as insufficient rigor in that examination. Without access to the actual investigative file, it is impossible for anyone outside the investigation to fully assess whether investigators have pursued this line as aggressively as they should have. What can be said is that no charges have been filed, that no arrest has been made, and that the investigation remains officially open, which means either that investigators have ruled out Gabe's involvement and are pursuing other theories, or that they have not been able to gather sufficient evidence to act on whatever suspicions they may have, or that the investigation is ongoing and may eventually produce results. All three of these possibilities exist simultaneously in the public record, and distinguishing between them from the outside is genuinely difficult. Let's talk about something specific that researchers have focused on: the question of Elaine's state of mind in the days immediately preceding her disappearance, and what it might tell us about what happened on the night of January 28th. In the days before she disappeared, Elaine had been living her normal life, practicing music, spending time with friends, maintaining her relationship with Gabe, keeping in daily contact with her mother. There is no indication from the public record of any dramatic escalation in her mental health struggles in those specific days, no crisis, no dramatic incident. No clear warning sign that the night of January 28th would be different from any other night. She had been to her therapist. She was taking steps to manage the anxiety and depression she had been dealing with. She was, by the account of people who spoke to her in the days before she disappeared, present and engaged and looking forward to things. The future, her music, her plans, the life she was building, was something she was actively oriented toward. This portrait of Elaine in the days before her disappearance, present, engaged, forward-looking, is something that her mother and friends have consistently emphasized, and it is something that complicates any narrative that relies on her mental state as the explanation for her disappearance. Whatever happened on the night of January 28th was not the inevitable result of a long deterioration. It was something that happened to a young woman who was, in all the ways that mattered, still fighting for her life and her future, and then the argument, and then the night, and then the silence. Whatever happened in that space, in those hours between her leaving Calabasas and the car appearing on Mulholland Highway, it happened fast, and it happened in the dark, and it left no trace that investigators have yet been able to find. But it happened. Something happened. And the truth of it is out there somewhere, waiting to be found. The question of whether it will be found, whether the investigation will eventually produce the answers that Camelia Park has been fighting for since the morning her daughter didn't call, is one that hangs over everything. It is not a question with a comfortable answer. Cold cases are solved. People who were thought lost forever are occasionally found. Perpetrators who believed they had escaped justice are sometimes eventually held accountable by the patient accumulation of evidence over years and decades. These things happen, but they don't always happen, and the mathematics of unsolved cases are brutal. The longer a case remains unresolved, the harder it becomes to resolve. Evidence is lost. Witnesses die or move or forget. The institutional memory of an investigation fades as the investigators who worked it retire and are replaced by people who inherit the file without the deep contextual knowledge that comes from having worked it from the beginning. This is the reality that Camelia Park faces every morning, the reality that the people who love Elaine and who are fighting for answers face every day. The possibility that the answer will come, and the equally real possibility that it won't. And the decision, made fresh every day, to keep fighting anyway. Because what is the alternative? What is the alternative to fighting for your daughter? For your friend, for a young woman who deserved to live, and whose story deserves to be told, and whose disappearance deserves to be explained. There is no acceptable alternative. There is only the fight, continued every day until the day it ends. We are going to talk about what the fight looks like now, about the current state of the investigation, and the current state of the community around this case. But before we do that, let's take a moment to think about something that I believe is important to hold in mind as we continue. Elaine Park was a real person, not a case file, not a mystery, not a story. She was a 23-year-old woman who played the cello and called her mother every day and loved the people in her life with warmth and generosity and care. She was someone who was figuring out who she was and where she was going, the way all of us are at 23, the way all of us are every age. She was imperfect in the ways that all humans are imperfect, struggling in the ways that many humans struggle, but also gifted and talented and loved and loving. She deserved to grow old. She deserved to continue playing her music, to travel to the places she wanted to see, to build the life she was building. She deserved the ordinary, extraordinary continuation of her existence in the world. That she didn't get to have, that is the central fact of this case. Not the mystery, not the investigation, not the theories or the forensics or the suspect analysis. Those are all in service of one simple, terrible fact: a young woman is gone. And the people who loved her have been denied not just her presence, but the knowledge of what happened to her and the justice that she deserves. Everything else, every detail we examine, every thread we follow, every question we ask, is in service of that central fact, of honoring Elaine Park by refusing to look away from what happened to her, by insisting on the truth, whatever it is, wherever it leads. That insistence, that refusal to look away, that is what Camelia Park has embodied for years, and it is what we owe Elaine in how we tell her story. Let's keep going. One of the aspects of this case that has received increasing attention in recent years is the question of what role, if any, the specific dynamics of the Calabasas area played in what happened. Calabasas is a wealthy community Expensive homes, gated neighborhoods, a culture that prioritizes privacy and discretion. It is not the kind of place where scenes play out in public, where neighbors are aware of what is happening in each other's lives, where the ordinary social surveillance of community life operates as a check on bad behavior. This insularity, which is a feature, not a bug for the wealthy people who choose to live there, also means that things that happen behind closed doors in Calabasas tend to stay there. That disputes and difficulties and the private dramas of intimate relationships unfold without witnesses, without the kind of ambient awareness that a more densely populated or socially interconnected community might provide. The argument between Elaine and happened in that context. In a private home, in a wealthy neighborhood, in the middle of the night, far from anyone who might have observed what was happening or who might have intervened if something went wrong. That insularity didn't cause what happened to Elaine, but it is part of the landscape of how it happened, part of the conditions under which something terrible could unfold without witnesses, without intervention, without a trail that investigators could easily follow. This is worth thinking about not just in the context of this specific case, but in the broader context of how we understand the conditions that make violence against women possible, and how the environments in which we live shape the risks we face and the protections we have access to. The privacy and wealth of Calabasas provided no protection for Elaine Park on the night of January 28, 2017. If anything, it may have provided cover for whatever happened to her. Let's move now toward the most recent developments in the case, and toward the question of where the investigation stands today, and what the realistic possibilities for resolution look like going forward. There is a moment in every long, unresolved investigation where the people closest to it have to make a choice. Not a dramatic choice, not the kind of choice that announces itself with fanfare or arrives with clear options laid out in front of you. A quiet choice, the kind that gets remade every morning, in the space between waking up and getting out of bed. The choice between continuing to fight and allowing the weight of years without answers to finally, mercifully, press you down into something that resembles acceptance. Camellia Park has made that choice every morning for years. And every morning she has chosen to fight. That choice made in grief, maintained in exhaustion, renewed in the face of repeated disappointment, is one of the most remarkable things about this case. Not the mystery, not the forensics, not the investigative details, but the sheer human determination of a mother who refuses to stop looking for her daughter, who refuses to allow Elaine's disappearance to become just another file in just another drawer in just another office building where unsolved cases go to be quietly forgotten. In recent years, Camellia has continued her public advocacy through multiple channels. She has maintained a presence on social media, periodically posting updates, reminders, requests for information, and expressions of love for her daughter that are simultaneously heartbreaking and galvanizing. She has given interviews to journalists and podcasters and documentary makers who have taken an interest in the case. She has connected with advocacy organizations, with other families of the missing, with researchers and investigators who have devoted their own time and energy to understanding what happened to Elaine. She has also, importantly, continued to push investigators, to ask questions, to demand accountability, to insist that the case remain active and that resources continue to be directed toward it. This kind of sustained pressure from family members is, in many cases, one of the primary drivers that keeps cold and unresolved cases from slipping entirely off the investigative radar. Without someone continuing to push, continuing to ask, continuing to make noise, these cases can simply go quiet, not officially closed, but practically abandoned. Camellia has not allowed that to happen. And because of that, Elaine Park's case remains in a state of active, if frustratingly slow pursuit. Let's talk about what the most recent investigative activity has looked like, and what the current state of the case appears to be from the available public record. As of the most recent reporting, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department continues to list Elaine Park as a missing person. The case has not been reclassified, has not been closed, and has not produced an arrest or a definitive resolution. Investigators have maintained contact with Camellia and have continued to review the case as new information, or new analytical tools have become available. One of the most significant recent developments in the broader investigation, one that has potential relevance to Elaine's case, has been the ongoing examination of Anthony Rada's activities in the Santa Monica Mountains over the full period of his presence there. Following his conviction for the Boudet murder, investigators have continued to work on establishing a complete picture of what Rada did and where he went during the years he lived in the hills. This work is ongoing and has not produced, in the public record, a definitive connection to Elaine Park's disappearance, but it has kept the possibility of that connection alive as an investigative threat. Prosecutors and investigators working the Rada cases have access to information about his movements, his habits, his patterns of behavior in the mountains that is not fully reflected in the public record. Whether that information includes anything that speaks to what happened to Elaine in January 2017 is something that may be known to investigators, but that has not been publicly disclosed. The possibility that a connection exists, that the investigation of Rada will eventually produce information relevant to Elaine's case, remains real and cannot be ruled out. There is also the question of DNA. In cases involving violence in wilderness areas, DNA evidence can persist for extended periods under the right conditions, or can be degraded rapidly under the wrong ones. The Santa Monica Mountains, with their varied terrain and weather, present a complex environment for the preservation of biological evidence. Whether any biological evidence was collected from the area around Elaine's car or from any other relevant location, and whether that evidence has been or could be compared against Rada's DNA profile or against any other profile in the national database, is something investigators would know, and that has not been fully disclosed publicly. Advances in forensic DNA technology over the years since Elaine's disappearance have been significant. Techniques that were not available in 2017 are available now. Techniques that can extract and analyze genetic material from smaller and more degraded samples than was previously possible. Techniques that can identify individuals through familial DNA connections rather than requiring a direct match. These advances have produced breakthroughs in cases that seemed completely intractable, identifying perpetrators from samples that were collected decades ago, and that technology of the time couldn't analyze. It is not unreasonable to hope that similar advances might eventually produce something useful in Elaine's case, if biological evidence exists that has not yet been fully exploited. But hope has to be calibrated honestly. The existence of new forensic tools does not produce results unless there is apply those tools to. If the searches have genuinely found nothing, no trace of Elaine, no biological material, then the best forensic technology in the world cannot manufacture results from absence. What advances in technology can do is potentially squeeze more information from evidence that was collected but that older technology couldn't fully analyze. Whether evidence of that kind exists in this case is something investigators would know. Let's talk about what a resolution to this case might realistically look like, because it is something worth thinking about carefully. There are several scenarios, ranging from the most hopeful to the most painful. The most hopeful scenario is that Elaine is alive. That something happened on the night of January 28, 2017, something traumatic, something that disrupted her life completely, but that she survived it and has been living somewhere, for reasons we don't fully understand, without contact with her family. This scenario, which has played out in some missing persons cases where the missing person eventually surfaces alive and with an explanation for their absence, is something that families of the missing often hold on to, because it is the only scenario that ends with the return of the person they love. Is it a realistic possibility in Elaine's case? It is not impossible. People do sometimes disappear voluntarily and resurface years later. But the specific circumstances of Elaine's disappearance, the belongings left in the car, the complete absence of any confirmed sighting in the years since, the character evidence suggesting she would never voluntarily cut off contact with her mother, make this scenario increasingly difficult to hold as a primary theory. It is possible, but it becomes less likely with every passing year. The second scenario is that Elaine's remains exist somewhere, in the mountains, in another location, somewhere that searches have not yet reached, and that eventually, through expanded search efforts or through information provided by a witness or through sheer chance, they will be found. This scenario would bring the worst kind of confirmation, the end of the terrible suspended grief, replaced by the acute grief of confirmed loss. But it would also bring the possibility of forensic information that could tell investigators what happened and, potentially, who was responsible. Finding Elaine's remains would not automatically solve the case, but it would change the nature of the investigation fundamentally. It would provide a location that could be analyzed for evidence. It might provide forensic information about cause of death, about manner of death, about the circumstances in which she died. It would transform a missing persons investigation, with all the limitations that classification imposes, into a homicide investigation, with the different resources and different tools that classification brings. The third scenario is a witness comes forward. Someone who knows something, who saw something on the night of January 28th, who was told something by someone, who has been carrying information that they haven't yet brought to investigators, decides to speak. This is the scenario that law enforcement most actively works toward in cases like this one, and it is a scenario that is genuinely possible. People carry secrets for years and then, for reasons that vary from case to case, decide they can no longer carry them. A relationship ends. A guilty conscience becomes unbearable. A chance encounter with information about the case triggers a decision that had been delayed. Witnesses come forward in cold cases with some regularity, and when they do, they sometimes carry information that breaks a case open. Camelia Park has consistently, publicly asked anyone about Elaine's disappearance to come forward. She has offered to receive information through investigators, through advocates, through any channel that might make someone more comfortable sharing what they know. The standing invitation is always open. If you know something, please say something. Elaine deserves it. Her family truth deserves to be told. The fourth scenario, the one that is hardest to contemplate but that must be acknowledged, is that the case never resolves. That the passage of time, the degradation of evidence, the silence of anyone who might have information, the persistent absence of Elaine herself, accumulates into a permanent mystery. That Camelia Park and the people who love Elaine are left forever in that suspended grief, forever without the closure that resolution would bring, forever holding the space between knowing and not knowing. This happens. It happens to families around the world, to families in this country, with painful frequency. Cases go cold and stay cold. Perpetrators die without confessing. Evidence is lost. The machinery of justice, already imperfect and already inequitable, simply fails to produce results. It is a terrible outcome, and it is a real one. And pretending it isn't possible would be a disservice to the people who live with that reality every day. But it has not happened yet in Elaine's case. The investigation is open. The community is engaged. Camelia is still fighting. And the truth is still out there waiting. Let's turn now to something that we haven't fully examined yet. The specific moments and details of this case that haunt people most powerfully. The images and facts that stay with you after you first learn about Elaine Park, and that don't let you go. There is the phone, sitting on the seat of the car. Charged or dead, we don't know, but there, in the car, on a cold night in January, on a dark stretch of highway in the mountains. The phone that Elaine used to call her mother every single day. Sitting there silent. There is the drive from Calabasas, 15-20 minutes, in the dark, upset. Whatever was going through her mind as she turned off Las Virgenes Road onto Mulholland Highway, as the city lights fell away and the mountains closed in around the road, as the darkness deepened. What was she thinking about? Was she thinking about the argument, about her music, about her mother, about what she was going to do next? Or was she not alone? Was someone else in that car with her, directing the route, making decisions that she had no power to override? There is the stillness of the car when it was found. Not abandoned in a dramatic way, not crashed, not damaged, not parked at an angle that suggested sudden stop. Just parked, neatly, ordinarily, as though someone had simply stepped away for a moment and planned to come back. The terrible ordinariness of it. There is the sound of Elaine's cello, in the memory of everyone who heard her play. The way music can outlast the person who made it, can persist in the bodies of the people who heard it, can return unexpectedly, in a quiet moment, in a dream in the space between waking and sleeping, and remind you of what was lost. There is Camelia Park's face in the interviews she has given over the years. The way she holds herself. The combination of grief and determination that she carries visibly in every public appearance. The love for her daughter that radiates from her even, especially, in the moments when she is talking about the worst things she has had to face. There is something almost unbearable about watching a mother fight this hard, this long for answers that haven't come, and something deeply, deeply admirable about it. There is January 29, 2017. The morning the phone didn't ring. The silence on the other end of a line that had never been silent before. The moment Camelia Park's world changed forever, before she even fully understood how it had changed. These are the details that haunt. These are the images that persist. And they persist because they are real, because they happen. Because they represent actual moments in the lives of actual people who deserved better than what they got. Now let's talk about something that has become increasingly relevant in the years since Elaine's disappearance. The question of what accountability looks like in a case like this one. What justice would mean and what it would require. If Elaine Park was murdered, if someone took her life on that night in January 2017, in the mountains or elsewhere, and has been living without accountability for that crime for years, what would justice look like? What would it require? At a minimum, it would require identification of the perpetrator, the establishment through evidence sufficient for prosecution of who was responsible for what happened to her. This is the foundational requirement. Without it, nothing else is possible. Beyond that, it would require prosecution, the actual engagement of the criminal justice system with the crime and the perpetrator, arrest, charges, trial, conviction. This process is slow and imperfect and frequently frustrating, but it is the mechanism through which society formally holds individuals accountable for violence against others. Without it, identification alone doesn't produce the legal acknowledgement that a crime was committed and that someone is responsible. And beyond that, though this is more complicated, more contested, it might require something like truth. Not just the legal verdict of guilty or not guilty, but the actual account of what happened. The story of that night, told in its full detail, with all the questions answered. Where did she go? How did it end? Why did her car end up where it did? These questions may or may not be answered by a criminal trial, depending on whether the perpetrator ever speaks honestly about what happened. They may remain even after a conviction, partially unresolved. Camelia Park has said that what she wants most is to bring her daughter home. To have Elaine's remains, if they exist somewhere, found and returned to her family. To be able to grieve her properly. To give her a resting place that her family can visit, that holds her presence in some physical form. This is a wish that is heartbreakingly simple and heartbreakingly difficult to fulfill. She also wants justice. She wants the person responsible for whatever happened to her daughter to be held accountable. She wants the system to work the way it is supposed to work, to do the thing it is supposed to do. She wants the law to look at what was done to Elaine and to say this was wrong, and there is a consequence for it, and she wants the truth, the full unvarnished. Whatever it is, truth about what happened on January 28, 2017. Not a comfortable narrative, not a convenient explanation, not the least disruptive version of events, the actual truth. However difficult it is, all three of these things remains, justice, truth, remain elusive. But they remain the things that define what resolution in this case would look like, and they remain worth fighting for. Let's talk about the role of advocacy organizations and what resources are available for families in situations like Camelia's. Because this is something that many people don't fully understand, the landscape of support that exists, or should exist, for families of the long-term missing. In the United States, the system for supporting families of missing persons is fragmented and inadequate in ways that advocates have been pushing to address for years. There is no single federal agency with comprehensive responsibility for missing persons cases. The work is distributed across local law enforcement agencies, state clearinghouses, federal databases, and a patchwork of nonprofit organizations that have stepped in to fill gaps that the official system leaves. The National Missing and Unidentified Person System, NAMIS, maintains a database that allows investigators to compare information across cases and potentially make connections between persons and unidentified remains. This system has been valuable in solving cases that would otherwise remain permanently unresolved, and it is something that investigators working Elaine's case would presumably be using. There are also organizations specifically focused on cases like Elaine's, cases involving missing persons of color, cases that have received insufficient mainstream attention, cases where families feel that the system has not served them adequately. These organizations provide resources, advocacy, media support, and in some cases direct investigative assistance to families who are fighting for answers without the full support of law enforcement behind them. Camellia Park has connected with some of these networks and has found in them both practical support and community. The understanding that comes from being surrounded by people who have experienced something similar, who know what it feels like to be fighting this fight. The fight is not without its costs. Years of advocacy, of public appearances, of painful interviews, of searches that end without answers, of hope raised and hope disappointed, all of this takes a toll. The physical and emotional cost of sustained advocacy in the face of persistent uncertainty is enormous. And it is something that families of the missing navigate largely without the kind of support, professional, institutional, financial, that would make it more sustainable. This is a gap in how our society treats the families of missing persons. We ask them to fight, and we provide them with inadequate tools and inadequate support for that fight. We ask them to keep going, and we don't adequately acknowledge the cost of keeping going. We benefit from their advocacy, because it is their advocacy that keeps cases alive, that maintains the pressure that occasionally produces results, and we do not adequately compensate them for the burden of that advocacy. This is worth naming, not as an accusation or a political argument, but as a simple truth about the landscape in which Camellia Park and families like hers have been operating. They deserve better. Elaine deserved better. Let's move now into the territory of what we might call the most likely truth of what happened, not as a definitive conclusion, because the case does not support definitive conclusions, but as the most honest assessment of the available evidence and what it most strongly suggests. Based on everything we know, the circumstances of the disappearance, the condition of the car, the absence of any trace in the searched areas, the character evidence about who Elaine was and how she lived, the presence of Anthony Rauda in the mountains, the questions about the relationship and the night's timeline. What does the evidence most strongly suggest? It most strongly suggests that Elaine Park did not voluntarily disappear. It most strongly suggests that something happened to her, something criminal, something done to her, either in the context of the relationship and the argument that preceded her departure, or in the isolated landscape of the mountains where her car was found, or in the space between those 2 points during the drive. It most strongly suggests that whoever or whatever was responsible for her disappearance has not yet been held accountable, and it most strongly suggests that the truth, while not yet found, is findable. That somewhere in the available evidence, in the memories of people who know something, in the landscape of the mountains that have kept their silence for years, somewhere in all of that, the answer exists. The question is whether we can get to it before time makes it truly unreachable. This is the question that underlies everything in this case. It is the question that Camellia Park has been living with since January 29, 2017. It is the question that investigators have been working to answer, with varying degrees of success and urgency. It is the question that the community of researchers and advocates who care about this case have been orienting their efforts around. And it is the question that tonight, as you listen to Elaine's story in the quiet of wherever you are, I want to leave with you. Not as a rhetorical device, not as a narrative flourish, but as a genuine ask. If you know anything at all, about what happened to Elaine Park, please come forward. Please contact the Los Angeles County Sheriff Department. Please contact Camellia. Please let the truth be told, because Elaine Park deserves the truth. Her mother deserves the truth. And the world is a little less of what it should be for every day that passes without it. We are almost at the end of our time together tonight. But before we get there, I want to talk about one more thing. One more dimension of this case that I think is important to acknowledge as we prepare to close. There is a way that true crime content, podcasts, YouTube channels, documentaries, scripts like this one, can inadvertently reduce real people to their tragedy, can make the story of a missing or murdered person primarily a mystery to be engaged with, a puzzle to be worked, rather than the life story of a human being who existed fully before the tragedy, and who continues to be fully real in the grief of the people who love them. I have tried, in telling Elaine's story tonight, to resist that reduction, to keep returning to who she was, the musician, the daughter, the friend and gifted and imperfect and fully alive young woman, rather than letting that person be subsumed by the mystery of her disappearance. I hope I have succeeded in that, at least partially. I know it is something that Camellia cares about deeply, that her daughter be remembered as a person, not just as a case. Elaine G. Young Park was born on April 5, 1993. She played the cello with a skill and a passion that moved the people who heard her. She called her mother every day. She loved the people in her life with generosity and warmth. She was 23 years old and she had everything to live for. She has not been found. But she has not been forgotten. And she will not be forgotten. Not tonight, not ever, not as long as there are people willing to tell her story and to fight for the truth of what happened to her. That is a promise. Not just from me, but from everyone who has listened tonight. From everyone who has spent any part of their evening in Elaine's company, learning who she was, caring about what happened to her, adding their attention and their care to the ongoing effort to find answers. You are part of that effort now. Just by listening, just by caring, just by refusing to look away, you are part of the effort to bring Elaine home. Thank you for that. Let's go to the final part of our story. In the years since Elaine Park disappeared, her case has become, for many people in the true crime and advocacy communities, something of a touchstone. A case that represents not just the specific tragedy of one young woman's disappearance, but the broader failures and inadequacies of a system that too often fails the most vulnerable people in our society. The failures of law enforcement to prioritize cases involving women of color. The failures of the media to cover those cases with the attention and resources they deserve. The failures of a missing persons infrastructure that is chronically underfunded and structurally inadequate to the scale of the problem it is supposed to address. Elaine's case has been cited by advocates, by researchers, as an example of what needs to change. Not because her case is unique in many ways, it is tragically not unique. It is representative of a much wider pattern, but because it is specific enough, humanized enough, documented enough that it can serve as a focal point for conversations about systemic change. Those conversations are happening. They are not happening fast enough, and they are not producing change fast enough. And the families who are living with the consequences of these systemic failures in the meantime are bearing a cost that is both real and unacceptable. But they are happening. And Elaine Park's story is part of what is driving them. That matters. It doesn't bring Elaine back. It doesn't give Camellia the answers she has been fighting for. But it means that Elaine's disappearance, this terrible, unjust thing, is contributing to something. That the attention paid to her case, the advocacy done in her name, the community that has formed around the fight for answers, is building toward something beyond the resolution of this one case. Toward a system that does better. That serves families more adequately. That ensures that the next young woman who disappears under suspicious circumstances gets the full weight of investigative resources and public attention that she deserves. That is Elaine's legacy. In part. Not the legacy she would have chosen. She would have chosen to go on living, to play her cello, to call her lover, to be present in the world for another 50 or 60 years. But it is a legacy nonetheless, and it is one worth honoring. Elaine Park has been missing for years now. The mountains have kept their silence. The car that was found on that cold stretch of Mulholland Highway is long gone from that spot, but the image of it unlocked, her belongings inside, the engine still, lives permanently in the minds of the people who loved her and the people who have fought alongside them for answers. We don't know what happened. Not yet. But we hold on to the possibility that someday, someone will say something. That someday, the truth will surface the way truth has a way of surfacing, quietly, unexpectedly, through a crack in the silence that has held for too long. If you know anything about what happened to Elaine Park on the night of January 28, 2017, please contact the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Please speak for Elaine, for Camelia, for the truth that this family has been owed since the morning the phone stopped ringing. Elaine Jeet Young Park was born on April 5, 1993. She played the cello beautifully. She loved her mother deeply. She was 23 years old and she deserved every single year that came after. Remember her name. And if you're drifting off to sleep right now, in the quiet and the warmth of wherever you are, hold that name gently as you go. Elaine, a young woman who was loved, a young woman who is still being fought for, a young woman who has not been forgotten and will not be. Thank you for listening tonight. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you care, please leave a comment, share this video, and subscribe to the channel. These stories deserve to be heard. These people deserve to be remembered. And your support makes it possible to keep telling them. Stay safe out there, and good night.